Hello, this is my video on how to write better persuasive essays, plus various tips and tricks. So a basic persuasive essay has 5 paragraphs. The first paragraph is your introduction. It's where you introduce to your reader what your topic is and how you feel about it. Your second paragraph is your first body paragraph. That's your first reason for believing what you believe in. Your third paragraph is your second body paragraph. That's where you let your reader know the second reason you believe in what you believe. Your fourth paragraph is known as your third body paragraph. Usually this is called a rebuttal because in this paragraph, you address a certain counter-argument that your opposition believes. The last paragraph is your conclusion. That's where you wrap everything up. So let's look at an example. Let's say that you're arguing about school uniforms. In this case, you're arguing that schools should not use school uniforms. So your first paragraph, your introduction, will talk about what school uniforms are and your stance on it. In this case, you don't want them. Your second paragraph would be the first reason why you don't want them. In this case, perhaps maybe they send the wrong message, which is that every student needs to be the same and be a part of a collective whole rather than their own individual. Your third paragraph would be the second reason you believe that school uniforms are more harmful than beneficial. Maybe that they limit student expression. In your fourth paragraph, you would address a common counter-argument that people who like school uniforms would usually make, such as they're often cheaper. In your last paragraph, you would conclude everything up and basically wrap up your essay. So once we have our topic, how do we actually make a strong argument? That's where the syllogism comes in. The syllogism was an old form of logical thinking used by the Greek philosopher Aristotle. To put it simply, it's a logical way to argue. To make a syllogism, you need 3 things. The first thing is a major premise. The second thing is a minor premise. And the last thing is a conclusion. Now, what do those things actually mean? A major premise is a universal truth. It's something that no one can really argue. For example, in his famous example, Aristotle said that a major premise is something like, all men are mortal. A minor premise is an observation related to the thing you want to argue. For example, Aristotle said, Socrates is a man. The conclusion is where you put both of these things together. In this example, if Socrates is a man and all men are mortal, then the logical conclusion is, Socrates is mortal. Let's go back to our example using school uniforms. In this case, the major premise would be something like, schools should value students' individual voices. The minor premise would be something like, uniforms take away a student's right to express themselves. Therefore, the logical conclusion is, uniforms violate school values. Sometimes, you'll find that you'll have to prove your major premise true, because some people might not necessarily believe in it. For example, not all people might believe that schools should value students' individual voices. In this case, you'd use a fact or some sort of anecdote or number in order to back this up. In this case, you could talk about protests, like when students protested the Vietnam War by wearing armbands. This is a true story, and one that later became a court case known as Tinker v. Des Moines. You can look this up later. So how does this look like in actual writing? You could write something like, schools should value each student's right to express themselves. In instances such as Tinker v. Des Moines, clothing was used as a form of protest when students wore black armbands to denounce the Vietnam War, proving that clothes could be used as a force for social change. Uniforms take away this ability for self-expression, however, and therefore shouldn't be used. In this example, the first sentence, schools should value each student's individual right to express themselves, is the major premise. The second part, where I talk about Tinker v. Des Moines, is where I'm supporting the major premise with the fact showing it to be true. The third part, the little dotted section here, is the minor premise. Again, it's the observation that I have established. The last part, the circle part, is the conclusion. It's where I put it all together. So now that we've gone over good arguments, let's go over bad arguments. These are called logical fallacies. A fallacy just means a flawed argument. Today, we're going to look at 4 logical fallacies. We're going to look at post hoc ergo propter hoc, ad hominem, strawman, and slippery slope. I'll go over each one. The first one is called post hoc ergo propter hoc. It basically is a fancy way of saying correlation does not necessarily mean causation. In other words, it means that just because B happened after A, that doesn't necessarily mean that A caused B to happen. For example, let's say that Trump was elected president, and shortly afterwards, a hurricane hit the US. But just because those two things happened at the same time, that doesn't mean that Trump being elected president caused the hurricane to happen. That's a failed argument. It's an example of a logical fallacy. In this case, post hoc ergo propter hoc. Obviously, that example was exaggerated, so let's look at a more realistic one. In 1915, Germany sank the Lusitania, a US boat. Soon afterwards, the US entered World War I. One conclusion you could draw from this is that Germany's sinking of the Lusitania angered the US, prompting them to go to war. However, this may not necessarily be true. There could be a variety of other factors why the US went to war. You could probably talk about the Zimmerman telegram, or the fact that we had financial interests in Europe. Again, just because two things happened very closely with each other doesn't mean that they caused each other. Hence, post hoc ergo propter hoc. The second kind of logical fallacy is an ad hominem, aka a personal attack. For example, let's say person A says, the US needs a universal healthcare plan. Person B responds with, how can I trust you? You're a liar. Regardless of whether or not person A is actually a liar, that doesn't have anything to do with his views. Attacking him instead of his argument is flawed, aka it's a logical fallacy. So the next kind of logical fallacy is the straw man fallacy. The name comes from a literal straw man, like a straw dummy. The straw man fallacy is when you set up a weak argument, then demolish it to make your own look stronger. Think about it as if someone was trying to prove they're a really good swordsman by setting up a straw dummy and then slashing that to bits. Obviously it's not a challenge, so it doesn't necessarily prove that they're a good swordsman, in the same way that taking that weak argument doesn't prove that you're a good arguer. Let's go back to our uniform example. Let's say that you said a common argument was that some say that uniforms look nice. And you counter that by saying looks aren't the most important thing, and basing school policy on superficiality is irresponsible. In this case, the imaginary person who you said says that uniforms look nice is your straw man. And when you counter that by saying that straw man was superficial and irresponsible, you took down that straw man to try to make your own argument look stronger. The problem is, however, is that you left a lot of important questions unanswered. For example, uniforms are cheaper, uniforms decrease bullying, and uniforms foster a sense of community. These are valid and strong counterarguments that you haven't addressed, and are therefore still lingering questions that could be in the back of your readers' minds. The last fallacy we'll go over today is the slippery slope fallacy. To put it simply, it means A leads to B and B leads to Z. In other words, it's when you over-exaggerate the effects that could possibly happen. Here's an example. Let's say someone says, if we let Mein Kampf, aka the book Hitler wrote, stay in libraries, then people will start to read it, spreading Nazi ideals, and soon the world will be full of Nazis again. Saying that just reading a book will make the world full of Nazis again is an over-exaggeration of the effects, and therefore a logical fallacy. Now keep in mind there are still a few fallacies that we haven't gone over today. Among the important ones, there are still non sequitur, red herring, begging the question, and many more. However, today we went over some of the more common ones. Just remember to use strong arguments like the syllogism, and avoid weaker ones like fallacies. Thank you.